Welcome to the first CoVA virtual research seminar. For those of you who haven't been to a CoVA research seminar before, we have these generally every 2 to 3 weeks, and this is our first one switching to the virtual realm. So bear with us with any technical glitches, but we've had a run through, and also we're all adapting pretty quickly to this space. So the seminar will go for about an hour to an hour and a half. Oh, I should say, I'm Susie Fraser. I'm coordinator of CoVA, and my colleague Eleanor Simcoe is also here, and she'll be on the chat screen when we get to the Q&A. So the seminar will go for about an hour and a half, and maybe if everyone, I think everyone's pretty much done it, but if you could mute your audio for the presentation, and that way there's no interference. And when it comes to Q&A, if you could, in the chat screen, send me, Susie Fraser, a direct message to indicate if you have a question or comment, and then I'll hand you over to STELARC. So you don't need to send me the question, but just say, hey, Suze, got a question or comment I want to throw STELARC's way. So I think that's most of the technical side. And I might now move to introducing our guest speaker, who really doesn't need much introduction, but I'm going to proceed on. So we really couldn't be having a more relevant conversation at this time than the one we're going to have today. During this time of physical distancing and virtual gatherings, STELARC's work is really appearing more prescient by the day. We're thinking about what is the body, what is the mind, is the virtual world now interchangeable with the physical world? So STELARC is a performance artist who experiments with alternative anatomical architectures. His performances incorporate prosthetics, robotics, VR, and biotechnology. He is presently surgically constructing and augmenting an ear on his arm. In 1996, he was made an honorary professor of art and robotics at the Carnegie Mellon University, and in 2002 was awarded an honorary doctorate of laws by Monash University. In 2010, he was awarded the Ars Electronica Hybrid Arts Prize, and in 2015, he received the Australia Council's Emerging and Experimental Arts Award. In 2016, he was awarded an honorary doctorate from the Ionian University in Corfu, and his work is represented by Scott Livesey Galleries in Melbourne. And I should also say that STELARC's most recent work is currently online as part of the Adelaide Biennial of Australian Art, and I'm sure he'll talk about this during his presentation. Thank you, STELARC.
Thanks, Susie. Yeah, just to preface the talk, you'll notice that I'm not going to be presenting these projects in a logical order. I'm sorry, I will be presenting them in a logical rather than in a chronological order. So I'll be skipping backwards and forwards in time, but they will sort of make sense at the end. And the presentation is really a series of text and visual prompts and provocations. So as well as my own projects, I'll include some other interesting research in medical, robotics and AI research areas. And the presentation will allude to issues of embodiment, agency, identity, intelligence, the post-human, the transhuman. Oh, that's interesting. Okay. So for me, a zombie is a body without a mind of its own, a body that performs involuntarily. cyborg is a human-machine system that is increasingly automated. We've always feared the involuntary. We're anxious about becoming automated, but we fear what we have always been and what we've already become. So in this increasingly video, virtual and vicarious world, the body asserts its materiality not as a site for the psyche nor for social inscription, but rather a site that needs to be sculpted. The body here is not an object of desire, but rather an object that requires redesigning.
And it was a lengthy process of a year to ensure that he met the true criteria to be the right patient for this transplant. And sure enough, he did meet this criteria. At that time, we described a procedure which would essentially restore everything which was not functioning and appearing normal on his face, which included of the scalp through the forehead, the upper lower eyelids, the nose, upper lower lips, soft tissues of the chin, down to the level of the neck, and the underlying structures, which included the upper jaw, bones around the eye sockets, the upper teeth, the lower teeth, as well as the anterior portions of the tongue.
Dr. Rodriguez, he suffered a gunshot accident back in 1997. Amazingly, his sight wasn't affected. He still had his vision, but as you say, he can now smell something he probably hasn't been able to do, for 15 years. He's now talking. Tell us about the moment that he was able to do these things.
So here, the face from the donor body stitched to the face of the recipient becomes a kind of third face, which resembles neither. In 2006, the artist's face was scanned, as was a hominid skull. The human face was then digitally transplanted over the hominid skull, constructing a kind of third face, one that becomes post-hominid and pre-human in form. So this 3D printed scaffold was seeded with living cells. So for several days before it got contaminated, there was a living skin over this part hominid, part human face. So this partial head is a partial portrait of the artist, which was partially living. Between 73 and 75, I made 3 films of the inside of my body, inside my stomach, lungs and colon, a total of 3 meters of internal space. You know, for the first time, I experienced the body not as a surface that I see and touch, but rather as an internal architecture of structures, spaces, and circulatory systems. Between 1975 and 1988, I did 27 suspension performances. These performances of stretched skin were in varying positions, in different situations, remote locations. This one, the body was suspended within a tensegrity icosahedron. None of the poles of wood or the body were touching. Everything was held together by the tension of the cables. You cut one cable, the whole structure collapses. The body here hoisted up and lowered down a lift well in Hardware Street, Melbourne. And the body here counts about rock. One rock reached insertion point. In fact, the body was gently swaying from side to side, setting up random oscillations in the rocks. This performance was stopped when the telephone rang in the gallery. A performance where the body was suspended, looking towards the horizon. No one really witnessed this performance except a group of fishermen on another outcrop of rocks. They were fishing before we arrived. They kept fishing during the performance, and they were still fishing when we left. So these suspensions are experiences in bodily sensation. They're expressed in bodily action, in remote spaces and in situations. They're not meant to be actions for interpretation, nor do they require any explanation. They're not meant to generate any meaning. Rather, these are sites of inertia and they're states of erasure. The remote control suspension was one in which my body was suspended vertically from a gang crane. Would hoist the body up, but also I could propel it forwards, backwards, sideways, left and right. Everyone thought it was just going to be an up and down performance, but as he progressed through the space, people followed. There was a barking dog and a crying child in the audience, which added a certain ambience. But I also discovered that when I stopped and suddenly could sort of a bonus in the choreography. This performance began with, and the performance ended when the body touched down. So about 20-minute performance. One of the few really public performances, the body suspended over East 11th Street in New York. I had a good view of the police cars that arrived after only about 5 minutes. I was arrested after I got pulled through, back through the window again. I was charged not for a display of public nudity, nor for performing some sadomasochistic action, but rather I was charged with being a danger to the public. And the other public performance over the Royal Theatre in Copenhagen, the body in fact was hoisted 60 metres high. This is the highest suspension. Interestingly, after about 30 metres, just above the level of buildings, all you could hear was the whooshing of the wind, the whirring of the crane motors, and the creaking of the skin. The third hand was my first augmentation of the body. Having done these series of performances where you explored the physical and psychological limitations of the body, there was this desire to somehow augment the body, because technological terrain, which interesting because it was actuated by electrodes on the abdominal and leg muscles. So picking up the electrical signals of the muscles and actuating the motors that generated the different motions. There was also a tactile feedback system. So you had a rudimentary sense of touch. Sophisticated enough at the time, it was completed in 1980, to be invited to the Jet Propulsion Lab in Pasadena and the Johnson Space Center to demonstrate the hand to the activity group. Now, initially, this was simply a visual attachment, an additional hand in performance. But I did try to do other more utilitarian actions here, writing one word, each hand writing a separate letter at the same time. I had to keep my two eyes on what my three hands were doing. Because of the spacing of the three hands, I had to remember which sequence of letters I was writing. I had to write every third letter. And because this performance was done on a sheet of glass between the artist and the audience, I had to learn to write it back to front. And that's the reason why I'm looking so perplexed during this performance. But as you can see, that it's a prosthesis not as a sign of lack, but rather a symptom of excess. As technology proliferates in microminiaturized form, you can attach it to the human body. Amplified body laser and eyes and third hand was a performance at the Maki Gallery in Tokyo. Here, lasers were directed to the eyes using optic fiber cable. By controlling the muscles around the eyes, you could literally scribble images in the gallery space. The sounds that you will hear are amplified body signals and sounds, brain waves, heartbeat, blood flow, and muscle signals. So this performance began when the body was switched on. And the performance ended when the body was switched off. Marshall McLuhan has an interesting definition of technology. Technology as the external organs of the body. So evolved as soft bodies with internal organs, but now inhabiting this complex technological terrain of fast, powerful, precise machinery. We need to engineer additional external organs to better interface with this technological terrain. The extended arm was an 11 degree of freedom, with an 11 degree of freedom manipulator. Wrist rotation, thumb rotation, individual finger flexion, but each finger splits open. So each finger becomes a gripper in itself. But whilst my right arm was extended to primate proportions with an additional arm joint, my left arm was computer controlled using an 11 degree of freedom muscle stimulation system that was computer programmed. This performance was for 4 hours continuously. Voltage in on the left side, involuntary movements of my left arm, voltage out on the right side, actuating an extended arm. These are not internal body signals and sounds, but rather sounds generated by proximity, flexion, and ultrasound sensors attached to the limbs. it didn't take much imagination that if you could control the body in a local space, you could control the body, you could program the body to move remotely. And this is actually going backwards in time now to 1995. The blue switches indicate which muscles could be programmed in this muscle stimulation system. And we had made this simple 3D model of the body by touching the muscles on the model. The model will simulate the movements that you've just programmed. And a second later in Luxembourg, where my body was, my body moved involuntarily. So in this particular performance, people in the Pompidou Center in Paris, the Media Lab in Helsinki, the Doors of Perception Conference in Amsterdam were able to remotely access and remotely activate my body in Luxembourg. Ping Body was another online interactive performance, but in this case, we used the Ping protocol. So during the 1 hour performance, we pinged 40 global locations. The reverberating pings that came back were measured in milliseconds, mapped to my body's muscles. My body moves involuntarily. The body here becomes a crude barometer of internet activity. Parasite was the third online interactive performance, but in this case, we customized a search engine. The search engine scans the net, selects anatomical images on the web, shows them to me in my head-up display. Those images are analyzed, and the complexity of those images generates the movements of my body. In other words, the images that you see are the images that move you. What's also interesting is that I have tilt sensors on my head, arms and legs. So here the body is the video switcher and live video mixer of the performance. So as well as the physical performance, you have this kind of cinematic video switching, video mixing that goes on as well. So in these projects and performances, it became really obvious that the body is neither all here nor all there, but partly here as this biological body and partly elsewhere, always, as its digital doppelganger. Now, these phantom bodies that appear online are not merely, or will not merely remain as images that you see, but rather also images that you feel with the increasing proliferation of haptic devices. So phantoms will become very much like phantom limbs. The ambidextrous arm is a project I initiated at Brunel University. Imagine, for example, an arm and a hand that is double jointed. So the fingers can bend one way, the thumb can rotate. You've got a right hand, but also the fingers can completely bend the other way. The thumb can rotate backwards. You've got a left hand and a right hand, all in the one universal design. And here we're just testing the double jointedness of the fingers. Having an ambidextrous hand, for example, if you lost your hand, an amputee, why not replace it with an ambidextrous hand? Sometimes two left hands might be better able to perform a task than the left hand and right hand. A project that I was involved in at Curtin University, where we developed this 3D printed actuated orthosis for a paralysed hand. So a person with a paralysed hand could wear this device What's interesting is that it could be scaled up easily. So whether it's a child's hand, whether it's a female hand, a male hand, you could scale your 3D model and then overnight print it, attack the linear actuator, and got an automated orthosis for a paralysed person, or as a means by which you might be able to remotely control a robot hand that's situated elsewhere. So all of these projects really are about exploring alternative anatomical architectures that go beyond simply biomimicry. There's also an interest in locomotors as well as manipulators. In 1997, when I was artist in residence in Hamburg City, with the help of artists, engineers, F18, a group of four engineers, we developed a six-legged walking robot, robust enough to support its body. And this robot was actuated by making different arm gestures. So you could select the different walking movements, forwards with the ripple gait, squat, it could turn on the spot. All of these robot actions could be selected by making different arm gestures. Exoskeleton was a 3-meter diameter robot. This muscle machine is 5 meters in diameter, a very large walking machine. But the idea here is to translate a human bipedal gait into a 6-legged insect-like locomotion. Encoders on the leg joints enabled me to lift one leg up, which triggered the 3 robot legs to lift and swing forward. So by stepping up and down, the robot could move forwards. Sensors in the chassis of the robot could detect which direction the artist was facing, and the robot would walk in that direction. The walking head robot, a 2-meter diameter robot, was autonomous and interactive. A rotating ultrasound sensor at the front of the robot detects if someone is in the gallery space. If someone is in the gallery space in front of the robot stands, selects from its library of possible movements, and then performs a choreography for about a minute. When it's over, it closes its eyes, goes to sleep, and waits for the next person to come along. It's a very loud robot. So the walking head was intended to be an actual virtual system where the mechanical movements of the legs would modulate the facial behavior of the head. A project hasn't been realised. This is an insect-like robot, a webcam mounted on its tail. The idea here was to engineer a robot that was small enough and robust enough to climb up my tongue and into my mouth. I just have to be careful not to swallow. But it's a kind of an artistic aesthetic gesture to the increasing intimacy with our machines. Technology will not always be external to the body. In a micro, miniaturized and nanoscaled form, technology will increasingly inhabit the inside of the human body. In fact, it might be possible to recolonize the human body with nanoscaled sensors and robots that would monitor and even repair pathological conditions. Imagine if a sensor could detect the first cluster of cancer cells. They could be more easily targeted and eradicated. Two philosophies, contemporary philosophies, that I think, if you're not familiar with them already, you should perhaps read up on them. These are both flattened ontologies that reject human primacy. ANT, or actor network theory, Bruno Latour, is a theory that indicates that our differences are generated in the network of our relations. In our relations with other bodies, machines, social systems. So these are all equally treated in a kind of symmetry. And OOO, or object-oriented ontology, the prime person there is Graham Harman. So here the focus is not so much in this flattened ontology on the network of relations, but rather here focusing on the objects themselves. And an object can be a real thing, a fictional thing, natural, artificial, human or non-human. These objects are seen to be mutually autonomous. Objects withdraw from each other. An object is a really good definition that Harman gives of an object, is that an object can neither be reduced to its component parts nor evaluated by its relations or effects. So it counters actor network theory, and this is more on the object itself. A good follow-on to Heideggerian discourses of objects and tools. Now I'm showing these other robotic research kits because I find them interesting in various ways. Here it's combining wheels and legs, so it's going beyond the normal biomimicry of examining insects and trying to translate them into robots, but here combining wheels and legs to what they call WEGs. And because of the springy nature of these robots can perform movements that we find somewhat athletic. These movements can be very fast on a flat surface, but these robots can also scamper over obstacles. So the combination of wheels and legs is this combination of human design principles with insect morphologies. And you've probably seen some of Boston Dynamics, sort of uncanny mammalian gait that's generated with this four-legged robot. It has stereo and depth cameras, and it can detect its environment, and the 5 degree of freedom gripper, which effectively turns its neck into a manipulator, is an interesting sort of chimeric function. And in the more humanoid Atlas robot, 75 kilograms in weight, about the average weight of a human body. You can see that it can perform athletically, and increasingly now will be interacting socially with human-like robots that function not only in a dexterous manner, but in a muscularly a powerful manner. So attach a computational system to this robot, and you have a very interesting interactive artificial entity. So what's interesting for me is this idea of vocabularies of aliveness. What minimum combination and sequencing of movements generate a sense of aliveness. David Hansen's robot head, he's an engineer originally, 32 micromotors which generate lifelike facial expressions and facial and human. Well, you know, we're hardwired to interact with other faces, and we empathize and project with faces with expressions. So again, kind of on the problem with robotics, the uncanny is that it have that more and more like they begin to feel creepy to interact with. Is this a kind of bad? Is a problem of state of the art? In other words, if we can increasingly replicate human features, human facial expressions, you know, I don't think they'll know that there are. It's not a problem only with robots. There are creepy people in the world as well. If I'm socially maladjusted, if I'm schizophrenic, I might equally be a problem in terms of interacting with socially. Two quotes that I find meaningful in our relationships to others and to machines. Nietzsche, there's no being behind the doing. The is merely a fiction added to the deed. It's the action itself that matters. So in a sense, agency is something that we attribute in retroactively. And Wittgenstein, who asserts that thinking doesn't have to be located inside your head. Thinking happens with the lips that you speak, with the hands that you write or the hands that you type. So this idea that somehow intelligence, this idea of somehow thinking has to be an internal or constructed as an internal act is, I think, just a convenient Western idea of what it means to be intelligent. We can now instantly generate hyperreal skins. And if these skins are mapped, we can animate these skins. And these skins at a screen level will be difficult to distinguish between what's an actual person at the other end of your interactive Zoom or Skype, or whether what's at the other end is in fact just a simulated.
Okay, so here's baby X, and this is, she's been learning to read words. Let's see what's on her page, and here we go, let's see what what's this, baby? What's this? What's this? What's this? Good girl. Insertion. Okay, baby, look over here. Okay, what's this? What's this? Good girl. Let's try something else. Okay. Okay, what's this? Baby, baby, over here. What's this? Baby, look at me. Look at me. What's this? Baby, over here. Over here. Good girl.
So this combination of high fidelity 3D modeling, and he's using his own baby here to construct this this avatar by combining the high fidelity 3D model, enough morph targets to generate facial expressions and lip syncing, combining cognitive sciences, modeling, awareness and curiosity behavior, and simply using a microphone on a computer and a camera on a desktop, you could generate this interactive system, and you can teach this artificial entity to speak. So increasingly now we're going to be surrounded by phantom flesh. In fact, the body increasingly experiences itself online as its phantom. And we all now have digital tools online. In 1993, I designed a sculpture for the inside of my stomach. Closed, it was a capsule structure that could be inserted down the esophagus into the stomach cavity. But when inside the stomach, the sculpture could open and close, extend and retract. It had a flashing light and a beeping sound. The idea for this project came about because the theme of the sculpture Trinale was site-specific works. But instead of a sculpture for a public space, I decided to design a sculpture for a private internal space. So here the body is not a site for the psyche, nor for social inscription. Rather, the body becomes a site for a sculpture, a site, an internal site for a work of art. Blender was a project done in collaboration with another artist, Nina Sellers. Both artists underwent liposuction. The biomaterial extracted from their bodies was inserted in an installation titled Blender. Blender can be seen as the inverse of the stomach sculpture. So instead of a machine installation or a machine robot, machinic robot inside a soft organ of the body, here a liquid body is encased in a technological support system. Anthropomorphic in scale. It's about the height of the artists. And there were sensors arrayed in the chassis of the installation. So when you approached and got close enough to the sculpture, the proximity sensors actuated the blender blades, mixing the biomaterial from the two artists' bodies. Interesting observations to think about human existence at the moment. There's an increasing decoupling of reproduction and individual existence. Some years ago, a 20-year-old frozen embryo was brought to bear as a healthy baby. Now, they think that they'll be able to freeze an egg for as long as 50 years. So what happens here if that's the case? It means that your twin might be born on your deathbed. You might be born several generations after your mother passes away. We're also very close to now engineering artificial wombs. We're already experimenting with animals. But imagine bringing to bear a healthy child in an artificial womb. Being developed externally, the baby would begin its existence without birth. It would not be born. And if we can replace malfunctioning components of the body with stem cell grown organs, 3D printed parts, then a biological body need not die. So how do we define human existence that doesn't begin with birth and doesn't necessarily end in death? The extra ear project began initially as an ear attached to the side of my head. Unfortunately, this was impossible to do. It was an anatomically dumb sight to have an ear on the side of my head, an extra ear. But in 2006, after 10 years of consulting, surgeons and funding, we began a surgical procedure which involved inflating, expanding the skin of my arm. But here, the second surgery where we're inserting the scaffold beneath the skin. When this skin is suctioned over the scaffold, after about 6 months, you have tissue ingrowth and vascularization occurring. So this ear becomes a living part of your arm, your body. It has its own blood supply. It still retains its sense of feeling. But the idea also was not simply to replicate the ear. We inserted a small microphone inside the ear construct. Unfortunately, it got contaminated and we had to remove it after about 10 days. But during the end of this second surgery, even with my arm wrapped in bandage, even having a partial plaster cast, even with the surgeon wearing a face mask, he could speak in my ear. His voice was picked up and wirelessly transmitted. So the idea here was not simply to replicate and relocate a facial structure to my arm, but rather to develop a listening device for people in other places, a remote listening device. an alternate anatomical architecture. This generated other artistic projects, a large 4 metre long ear on arm sculpture, laser scanned, laser cut. But in this exhibition at the Lawn Sculpture Biennale, I also performed lying on the sculpture. My body was covered with white slip, white clay. As the body lays on the sculpture for the duration of the performance, because of the warm body and the very cold climate, the clay cracks. So you have this cracked skin, this body lying on a large sculpture of an ear on its arm. But whilst lying on the sculpture, I thought it would be really interesting to do one more suspension performance where my body would be suspended above the sculpture. We inserted 16 hooks into the skin of the back. When the body was fully rigged, the body was hoisted up. Make sure that everything's been removed correctly. Go and go. Now, I knew that when the steel cable, the full weight of the body, because the steel cable is braided, it begins to untwist, and as it untwists, the body begins to spin. I thought this would last for about 5 minutes, but the body kept spinning for about 15 minutes. When the body was in approximately the same position as it was hoisted up, it was lowered down. So this performance, in fact, begins when the body was and when the body lowered back onto the sculpture. With the propel performance, my body was attached to the end of the robot arm. And here the body could be precisely programmed in its position orientation, with its velocity, with its trajectory. It's a 3D space. The sound was important. When the performance finished, my body was replaced with a large sculpture of the ear on my arm, and the same choreography performed. What's interesting, though, was the robot that choreographs the movements of the ear is the same robot that carved the ear. So increasingly now we're in fact becoming more coupled and complicit with our technology. The body becomes this extended operational system of bodily metabolism and machine musculature. So for me, there was always a ghost in the machine, but a ghost not as a vital force that animates, but rather as a fading attestation of the human. The stickman was a minimal but full body exoskeleton that algorithmically actuated the body for 5 hours during its performance. We also had engineered a mini stickman that the audience by manipulating the limbs of the mini stick man, could insert their choreography into the performance, a kind of, electronic voodoo. I've sent you the links to the performance video, so I don't have time to show all the videos today, but the Stickman, Mini Stickman performance is one that I think was, it was the precursor to the reclining Stickman for the Biennale, which I'll discuss later. So in these liminal spaces of proliferating prosthetic bodies, partial life, artificial intelligence, the body has become a floating signifier. The body has become whatever we want the body to be. The exoskeleton arm was engineered for the rewired, remixed performance. So it's an arm that I could wear, including over my hand and fingers. And in this performance, for 5 days, 6 hours every day, continuously, I could only see with the eyes of someone in London. I could only hear with the ears of someone in New York, but anyone, anywhere, could access my right arm and remotely activate it. So here you had a situation where you could distribute your agency to people in other places and share your visual and acoustical senses. Again, I've sent the link of this performance. So this body effectively has become this contemporary chimera of meat, metal, and code, of biology, technology, and information. A body that is animated and prompted by machine mechanisms and viral algorithms. The reclining stickman is a 9-meter large stick figure animated by pneumatic rubber muscles. It's a project that can be accessed online, and now you can also access the performance video online, the full performance video online. But what's interesting here is during the performance, the artist can actuate the robot using pneumatic joysticks, whilst anyone in the gallery, through a control panel, can insert their own movements, whilst simultaneously someone online can contribute to the interactivity for this kind of complex and extended operational system, which is a body on a robot, a stick robot. The shadow of the body and the robot into this one kind of chimeric architecture. Also, the sound is very important. The droning of the motor that continuously rotates the robot, the solenoid clicks, which are amplified, and also the compressed air that is the result of the contracting and extending, compressing and exhausting rubber muscles. it is difficult to get a sense of the scale of the robot, its physical, material and acoustical presence, because the sound not only registers the movements of the robot, but also extends to completely fill the cuboid space of the gallery. So what's happening now? Increasingly, there's no distinction between the operation of biological and machine systems, but also there's increasingly now no distinction between the living and the dead, and that the living are only a species of the dead. So we know we can preserve dead bodies, we can preserve cadavers with plastination. We can also simultaneously sustain comatose bodies on technological life support systems. So dead bodies need no longer disintegrate, near dead bodies need not die. Dead bodies continue to have a material existence. And of course, these can be anatomically exhibited in ways that we couldn't before. Dead, the near dead, the brain dead, the yet to be born, the partially living and synthetic life all now share a material and proximal existence with other living bodies, microbial life, operational machines, and executable and viral code. And here I'm sort of expressing a flattened ontology. Now we know that we can 3D print with living cells. If we can 3D print something like the complexity of a bodily organ, here a heart, that would be only half the problem. We'd have to put this 3D printed heart into a vat of nutrients. We'd have to electrically stimulate it. Hopefully it would then begin to pulse, and then we could transplant a heart that would be composed of your own stem cells. There would be no immunological response. Now, if we were 3D printing bodily organs, if we were stem cell growing bodily organs, we would then have a situation of an excess of organs awaiting bodies, of organs without bodies. In 2011, the first twin turbine heart was inserted into the chest of a terminally ill patient. He lived for a few days to fully test this new, more robust and more reliable twin turbine artificial heart. What's interesting though is that this twin turbine heart circulates the blood continuously without pulsing. So in other words, in the near future, you might rest your head on your loved one's chest. They're warm to the touch. They're breathing, they're sighing, they're speaking. They're certainly alive, but they have no heartbeat. So what it means to be human is perhaps not to remain human at all. You know, we'll be increasingly a bodily construct of biology, technology, and algorithms. The best is to generate contestable futures, possibilities that can be interrogated, that can be evaluated, that can be possibly appropriated, but most likely discarded. So futures should not happen of necessity, but rather more of contingency. Thanks very much.
Hi, Stellar, can you hear me?
Yes. Yep.
Hi, thank you so much for this. I'm sure everyone's clapping along with me. That was really a fantastic presentation and great to hear from you a really nuanced overview of your career. So thank you everyone for coming along, and also for bearing with the small glitches and the trickiness of the technology, but we heard most of your presentation and we saw all of it, so that was fantastic. I think the videos flummoxed the system a little, but yeah, would anyone like to, it was very minor, but does anyone have stage or a comment for STELARC?
Sorry, I didn't get back to you this morning. It was just so much.
Oh,
yeah.
Sorry, I think maybe someone's on. Still got their mute on. Does anyone have a question or a comment? I'm just watching if you have anything you'd like to say, just pop it on the chat screen, or if you'd like to say me, I will hand it over. So you can just direct message me. One thing I was thinking about STELARC was in one of the readings that you set, it was your V&A text from 2017. You noted that machines are generally more robust and reliable than the soft, vulnerable and fatigue-ridden bodies. I suppose that's very relevant now. Well, I was wondering what you were thinking. Oh, maybe I should wait for you to respond.
Oh gosh. Yeah, we're breaking. Yeah, unfortunately, we're breaking up. I question, but if I can, you hearing me now?
Yes, yeah, a little bit glitchy, but we can hear you.
But try again, please, with the question. I'm sorry. Susie, your question was breaking up. I couldn't get the.
Okay, we'll try this. So we'll see how we go for the last few minutes. But I was just thinking about your essay from 2017, the one you set for us to read from the Victoria and Albert publication. You talked about machines as being more robust than bodies, than human bodies, which obviously seems particularly relevant right now, where we're fleeing from viral contagion. I suppose something that seems to me an inherent vulnerability on our reliance on machines is that they're separate from us, though. So, for instance, if we have our mobile and we leave it on the tram, we're disconnected from that part of us. So it in itself becomes a vulnerable part of the body or non-part of the body. Have you at all thought about that tension?
Well, I guess these ideas are postulating more complex operation, which really increasingly are about human machine constructs rather than purely biological or for that matter, purely machinic. I mean, you're looking at a body that is gulping air continuously for it to survive. You're looking at a body whose heart has to beat millions of years reliably for this body to stay alive. If my internal temperature varies only 3 or 4 degrees, I'm in serious health risk. If I lose body fluid, dead. So we have very slim survival parameters. Now, of course, that's not to say that machine systems, you know, at the moment they don't have the flexibility, and of course they rely on a kind of an ecosystem of satellites and power stations and all sorts of other interconnected systems of control and actuation. But if we think the body not in that kind of romantic Rousseau-esque way of you know, of a body in nature, but rather a body that needs to interface and interact increasingly with its own artifacts, then we have to consider these possibilities. But there's no guarantee that extended and complex operational systems will in the end prove more effective because they also might become increasingly vulnerable to glitches. Maybe I was a little too ambitious in presenting.
No, it's
together.
Yeah. I do have a question from one of the group who I'm not sure if everyone's mics are working. Leila, did you want to say your question?
Actually, I also noticed, I've just noticed that a number of mics are not activated.
Yeah.
So that doesn't help, I don't think.
Yeah. Oh, Leila, hi.
Hello. Yeah. I have a question. Yeah, I was just wondering, like, in regards to your suspension pieces, there's obviously like a huge amount of pain that you have to endure, and I was wondering, like, what's your sort of thought processes, and like, how did you prepare for those, that sort of stuff?
Yeah. When I mean, these were the result of a series of sensory deprivation and physically difficult actions, and so the management of these, these sort of painful experiences were incrementally got harder and harder. And of course, suspending your body with hooks, and there's no medication, there's no anesthetic used. But this is not an uncommon kind of action, you know, in Hindu Indian rituals and in the contemporary suspension and modification community. There's a lot of piercing that's done. There's a lot of body suspension that's done. But the way that I like to characterize my attitude to doing this is that I perform the posture of indifference. Indifference as opposed to not having expectations. So you allow your body and you allow the performance to unfold with its own time, with its own rhythm. You know, you've obviously thought and planned these performances. but then there's a point in time when thinking has to stop and the physical action begins. And so you just do it.
Just do it. Love it. Thank you.
I didn't want to sound like some athletic advertisement there.
No, not at all, not at all.
But actually, it does expose, you know, I mean, that commercial ad does expose this kind of, I think a lot of us don't do things because we kind of psych ourselves out of doing them. We overthink them. You know, of course, you have to initiate action with an idea, or generally you initiate an action with an idea, but don't overthink the idea. Don't, you know, trust in your body and trust in the planning of the performance. Otherwise, you don't do anything.
Yeah. Gorgeous.
Yeah, we actually had a couple other of those questions, similar questions. How do you prepare for performances that are so grueling? So yeah, everyone's thinking about the same, very similar things coming out of it.
And for example, with the Rewired Remixed performance, that was 6 hours every day for 5 days. And with your senses split and your arm not of your own agency. And I had no idea beforehand what that was going to be like. I mean, we did some initial kind of testing, but nothing that could have predicted whether this body would be able to kind of endure those 6 hours every day. I mean, I was on my feet, wired in to everything, and I had to pivot my body when my exoskeleton arm was actuated because it's rather heavy, but to retain my balance. Yeah, I had no idea of whether that was going to be possible. As it turned out, it was.
Any other questions, comments from the room?
I actually had a sort of question, or just a sort of comment in regards to you sort of talk about removing myths or like romance from ideas of our body, and if that, like, what your kind of spiritual ideology or sort of thinking is, if it even has a sort of like spiritual basis, or if it's purely about a kind of scientific approach to body and life.
Yeah, I think we have a problem of language when we speak, you know, about, for example, the spiritual, because that has a whole lot of cultural baggage to it. I mean, the more and more performances I do, the less and less I think I have a mind of my own, nor any mind at all in the traditional metaphysical sense. And, you know, I can point back to that statement by Wittgenstein, for example, that you have a notion of agency or the notion of a mind or the notion of thinking as simplistically happening inside your head. I mean, we've gone from one extreme to the other. We've gone from sort of our early philosophies, which emphasized embodiment, to post-Cartesian philosophy, where we focus on the brain. And but Merleau-Ponty, for example, would say that the body doesn't so much inhabit a world as a sort of a separate entity, but rather the body expresses the world. So the body is an expression of the complexity of the world that it inhabits. So I guess a lot of these projects and performances expose, and I would like to expose, our simple assumptions of what a body is and how a body operates. I mean, one can argue we've always been prosthetically augmented bodies. When we evolve and stand upright, two limbs become manipulators. We begin to make artifacts. We begin to engineer instruments and machines. Of course, language was an early technology. So the body has always been a biologically inadequate body. And what defines us now are our social systems, our culture, and the technologies that allow us to extend our paradigms of the world that we inhabit. So we tend to, imagine that, it's our biology that is tantamount. That's why I'm so seduced by flattened ontologies. Whether you're a body, a microbe, a machine, an algorithm, a tree, all of these sort of objects, all of these things are treated equally in a complex interactive system.
Thank you. Anyone else? Carleng, hi.
Hi, STELARC. Thank you for that. I was just wondering. Yeah, it's fascinating. I was just wondering if you have, what are your thoughts on the body in, well, one of kind of like a present future, which is like the pandemic, and
I'm sorry, the body as
the body within the present like pandemic, and how if, let's just say, more pandemics like this happen, or futures in which are unpredictable and which confines the body to a space, how do you see that as how do you see that sort of like, I don't know, do you have any thoughts on the body as in that space?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of get irritated if we're simply being reactive to something, to anything. Now we're all kind of self-isolating, or essentially located in our home spaces instead of being in proximity. So I think this increasing intimacy without proximity is going to be something that we're going to be experiencing more and more. At the moment, I only see you, I only hear you, but there are haptic devices which will enable us to have a sense of touch, have force feedback, so our phantom representations will become increasingly more physical, to the point perhaps where we won't be able to meaningfully distinguish between the two. I did a performance in 2000 where we engineered an avatar with genetic algorithms whose behavior sort of changed for the duration of the performance. And that avatar could access my body in the real world and perform with it. So it was a kind of inverse motion capture system. So instead of me manipulating my avatar, you know, using motion capture or whatever, here the avatar would access my body and perform with it in the real world. In this realm of mixed realities, we're going to increasingly be expected to perform sometimes as biological bodies, sometimes as machinically augmented bodies, and at other times in virtual reality systems or interfacing with our avatars. So to be able to seamlessly slide between these different modes of operation without necessarily prioritizing one or the other will be very, very interesting. I mean, the idea of augmented reality points to that. But at the moment, you know, head-up displays are still a little bit cumbersome, and they're still a little bit socially distracting. So I think we have to learn to function not only in physical spaces, but in these electronic spaces as well.
Thanks for that. Do you see like the sort of body architectures to sort of extend into a sort of like a mass consumption sphere in terms of haptic feedback and all that sort of thing to sort of extend that intimacy across?
Yeah, I mean when I was doing the early experiments with muscle stimulation, people in other places could animate my body by directly stimulating it with electrical signals, right? And that was only a one-way system. But it's plausible, it's very possible, in fact, to engineer a two-way system. So, for example, you, wherever you are, and me, wherever I am, might be able to access a half of each other's bodies. So my right arm might animate your left arm. Your right arm might animate my left arm. It would be an interesting situation where our agencies would be split. We would sort of construct these split bodies, control of each other's bodies. What I'm really alluding to here is that what's meaningful is not who is in control anymore. It's not a matter of control. Rather, in a complex interactive system, who is in control is not important.
Fascinating, thank you.
That seems like an extraordinary statement. Who is in control is not important. I suppose as we move more online, and I suppose some of your work thinks about or considers surveillance with the ear on the arm, and kind of as we're moving into a more virtual world, the potential for hacking, for surveillance, for monitoring. Who is in control seems very pertinent. But in a...
Yeah, well, I think, yeah. No, agreed. I think, you know, we generate a much more kind of fluid interactive system.
Yeah.
Of course, there are going to be agents,
yeah,
you know, that are sinister, that will try to, you know, invade your interactive system or even your body. I mean, if we're going to insert technology, if we're going to insert chip circuitry into our bodies, you know, they could be hackable. I met the first, or not the first, well, I met the first double hand transplant actually at a medical conference in Paris, and many years ago, maybe 15 years ago. I don't remember the exact year, but after only 6 months, he could animate his cadaver hands. He had a rudimentary sense of pressure, touch, texture. Now, okay, they're the hands from a cadaver, and now they're directly connected to his own nervous system. Okay, but increasingly now we have a population of people who have prosthetically who are prosthetically connected with arms and legs that are or will soon be directly wired to their nervous system. So, you know, what happens when, you know, your hand is not under your control? in fact, there is a pathological condition where someone's hand, they lose control of it. I forget the name of that the medical name for it, but there was one famous case of someone's hand trying to choke its owner.
Wow.
Which technologies that we have attached and have any sophisticated interface to our bodies, yes, they might be hacked, but you know, there are ways of you know, having electronic barriers and having IDs and having, you know, like Zoom has been hacked already, even though we, you know, supposedly we can, you know, we need a kind of a Zoom address to all connect up together.
Yeah, absolutely. It's lots of avenues for exploration and stumbling through and finding new ways. But was there any other questions or comments? I noticed that we've gone a bit over time, but thank you so much, STELARC. That was such a interesting, as I said at the beginning, so relevant to what we're all thinking about right now, about being more connected to our machines. And yeah, it's a real privilege to have you in the room. And we have some of your, I think that's a fly on my monitor. I don't know if anyone saw that. I was like, what was that? But yeah, we have the recording. And as I said, there were a few glitches in it, but we might edit out some of the glitches and then share it around with people who couldn't be in the room as well.
I think it's a real problem because I've noticed that my Wi-Fi seems to vary during the day, and because everyone is stuck at home, there's more internet use being done, and if your next door neighbour is downloading a movie or something, you know, you could be in trouble. So it's a shame. But I don't know if I could do this, but what I've done before is the presentation offline and then sending you that if you would like.
Oh, that would be phenomenal as well if you had the time. I'm sure we'd all love to.
Just that you wouldn't get, you know, the windows of other participants and stuff like that. Or if you send me your Zoom recording, I can see whether I can patch it as best as possible. But
Yeah.
I'm really sorry about it, because I think sometimes when you do an online interview and then you get the transcription back, either the transcription of a word or two can completely change the meaning of what you've said. So
Oh, definitely.
I hope you've gotten enough without all the glitches to kind of understand what was being said here.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And of course, everything that's said is contestable.
Yeah.
This is not about having an ideology, but generating prompts, whether they're visual or textual, that lead to more interesting ideas.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's a good, and it's also a great place to conclude the taking ideas and having new ideas. And I'm sure as a lot of people in the room are training, practicing artists, it's very important to kind of hear, obviously, from an established, internationally respected artist as well. Well, maybe we can discuss.
I might be, yeah, I might be established, but in no means respected.
Thank you very much, STELARC. I really appreciate it. And thank you, everyone. Hopefully, we'll see you at the next.